Could you turn the volume up a little, please? There's still more to the movie, so.
Have a look, because they're doing a salmon enhancement program along the creek here. Here's where the salmon usually come right in this corner.
Wow.
There is salmon, right there.
Okay, look at them.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. They come up here to spawn in the place where they were born. It's uncanny how they can sense it.
Slides up here. Hello, everybody. Just want to acknowledge that David Suzuki caught a bus and he's now in the room. So, welcome, David. Yeah, just to kind of kick things off, David, you've lived in Vancouver all your life. These are some photos of David when he was a young child. And David, do you want to tell us about the changes that you've seen over the course of your lifetime here?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Vancouver, as were my parents. And I remember vividly, since we're Japanese, fish were a big part of our lives. And we used to, Dad used to take me, we would troll around Siwash Rock in Stanley Park for sea run cutthroats. We'd go off Spanish Banks and catch halibut, or down to the Fraser and gather ulican. I mean, it was a glorious area. But today, of course, my grandchildren are fish-oriented, and they say, Grandpa, let's go fishing. But I can't take them where I went as a child, because we've used up their rightful legacy. What they should, my children and grandchildren should have been able to experience what I did and what people did since the beginning of time. And so that, I think, is the indication of our problem. In the name of development and economic growth, we've really sacrificed a tremendous amount of what should be a sustainable legacy for future generations. So yeah, Vancouver's a way bigger city. But when I was born in 1936, there were still bears and cougars in Vancouver. You know, it's a very different place.
Wow. And Frank, as someone who has grown up along the coast in Heiltsuk territory, do you want to take us through your kind of journey and the things that you've seen and the changes you've seen over the course of your lifetime here?
Well, I think, first of all, I want to give the props to the joint working group for this Guardian initiative, who recognized the importance and value of sharing this film. You know, it's part of the why of the importance of Indigenous guardians. And it was their decision to decide to share this film, to, you know, bring it into focus. And a part of the work that we're doing is to be able to basically monitor and hopefully mitigate some of these issues within our territory. And this is a take-home message for all of us. And I thank both of you for bringing this issue to the public in the way that you're doing. In response to the question, I mean, we have a very ancient society, and the canoe is how we traveled, and it was basically the same for 700 generations, and it just abruptly changed. And we're very challenged, and it's a paradox. We as Indigenous place-based people are some of the most marginalized people in society because of our commitment to our values and our teachings, And the rights that we have under treaty are Aboriginal rights, where we have some leverage to basically try to stop the insanity. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
Well, speaking of, the challenging times, one of the things that David and I have been talking about on the road is this. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out in October. And if you were kind of following the news in this cycle, you would have seen a tremendous amount of headlines about this, but it kind of dissipated almost. And the stark warning that the United Nations Ipcc put out is essentially that we have literally a dozen years to bend down the curve of our emissions, to rein in the greenhouse gases, to get them down to 45% of what they are by 2030, and we have to be globally carbon neutral. I'm going to say that again, globally carbon neutral by 2050 if we're to avert the worst that climate change is kind of the science is suggesting will happen. And so again, we've got David Suzuki in the room. David is a world-famous geneticist. Some of you will know him as the host of The Nature of Things and as an environmentalist, but he's actually a world-famous geneticist. And as having a world-famous scientist in the room, David, what are your thoughts on the IPCC report?
Well, I think this is a wake-up call, or at least the opportunity of giving us something to aim for. I just want to remind you that in 1988, when the IPCC was established as the critical organization or group of scientists to tell us the state of what we knew about climate, in 1988, climatologists called for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 15 years. That was a call. That was a target. If we had taken it seriously and done, not only would we have saved huge amounts of money, but we would be well on our way towards that carbon-free energy society that we're now aiming for. But we didn't. And the IPCC, because it's an intergovernmental panel, its reports, which are based in science, are then vetted by every government that has an interest, including Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United. They all look at these reports. And so when they come out, the conclusions and the predictions are always unbelievably conservative. And every 5 years when the IPCC reports have come out, they have always fallen short of what they predicted would happen in the next 5 years. So getting this special report was a shock to me, because now they say it very clearly, that if we allow temperature to rise above 1.5 degrees, above pre-industrial levels, that all hell breaks loose, that we simply have no idea how the underpinnings of civilization, starting with food, will be sustained. And so it's a very uncertain future. And I just want to remind you that in 2015, when Trudeau was elected, boy, was that ever wonderful after 9.5 years of climate denial by the Harper government. And Trudeau not only announced Canada's back, signed the Paris Agreement, which said let's limit temperature rise to 1.5 to 2 degrees. And Trudeau said, no, yes, we're signing it, but we want it to be as close to 1.5 as possible. That was incredible. I mean, we celebrated. It was really great. And I think the SNC-Lavalin thing, which reveals all kinds of things, but to me it shows the enormous power of corporations. Corporations hold governments hostage now simply by threatening to move their office to another country or to lose a number of jobs. And if you think SNC-Lavalin is a big company, you can imagine the enormous lobbying power of the fossil fuel industry. So this is really the challenge. The call is out there with that IPCC report. The question is whether we have the political will to really do it in the face of all that lobbying.
So again, the IPCC is the United Nations kind of world group of experts and scientists working on this issue, and this is their kind of report saying that there are some serious challenges ahead. I think it also speaks to the importance of guardians and monitoring and watching what's going on the landscape. These are not disconnected conversations. And on that note, Frank, as a hereditary chief in the Heiltsuk territory, you know, when you think about the future of climate change and you think about the potential changes to the lands and the waters, how does that make you feel? What is your sense of where this is all going?
Our people have been around long enough to know to have seen climate change in the past. The last ice age, our neighbors to the north, the Heiltsuk and the Heiltsuk. The Heiltsuk are the people on the border of the snow or the ice, and the Heiltsuk are the people of the ice. So at one time, the whole this part of our world was covered by ice. But what is very different about this situation is that we know that this is the first time in the history of the Earth that we have had this type of an impact. And they did the core samples in the polar ice caps, and the smoking gun, literally, is those core samples into the polar ice cap when they found carbon, you know, when it snows and then there's compacting, and it was, you could see the carbon starting to be seen. Like the core sample's 200,000 years old, but right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that's exactly where you could pinpoint where the carbon began to come into our atmosphere through industrialization. So it puts us as Indigenous place-based people in a very challenging place to be able to share with the mainstream society important lessons on sustainability. I think that's now beginning to be recognized by, for example, the environmental community. You heard the words of our brother from Australia, that leader that came over and shared with us their experience. And he talked about how they have done this incredible work for their rangers. And in their work, they said, you have to let us do it. Give us the resources to do it, because he said before the parks wouldn't give them the resources, the money to do the work. And that's exactly where we're at. We're telling Canada, you give us the money and let us do the work. We're talking about a fundamental shift away from this paternalistic relationship that has brought us to this place, because they always thought they knew better. Western science, in all due respect, sir, takes about, in the case of managing fish, they've collected 40, maybe 50 years of data. And then they take that data and they extrapolate out, and they create computer-generated models which are nothing more than educated guess. And they say, this is it, the best of what Western science has to offer. And we have been embattled in the war in the woods over various fisheries, salmon, herring, and said, no, you're wrong. And in some cases, we've had to take direct action to shut them down. And so hopefully we'll get to a more constructive relationship where they can actually not only listen, but hear and support initiatives like this National Indigenous Guardian Network. That's why I'm here. I'm putting my shoulder into this to support it, because I believe in it. And I believe we all believe in it, because it is the solution to go forward.
Thank you, Frank. This kind of interesting conversation is in some ways about how do we use the best of both science and traditional knowledge? And that's something I'm interested in. We built something called the Climate Atlas of Canada. I'm just going to burn through a couple of quick slides here. It's got the best available climate model data for Canada inside an interactive platform that you can click through. So you can actually go to climateatlas.ca right now and check this out. You know, in the Guardian's work, this might be interesting. If you're trying to think about, you know, what kind of future change might exist in my lands and territories, you can go here and check it out. But there's also these play buttons, which are linking local knowledge and traditional knowledge to that science in a way that is attempting to be integrative. And so, you know, for example, this is Kamloops, the number of plus 30 days. In an average year in Kamloops, they get about 25 plus 30 days, and in the 2050s to 2080s, in a high carbon kind of far future, that's going to jump up by about almost 37 plus 30 days. So a place like Kamloops is going to have, on average, about 60 plus 30 days in the 2050s to 2080s. If you click around the map, there's stark data in here. If you look at the Arctic and you look at the loss of minus 30 days, it's truly astounding. And so this is a tool that you can use now in your Guardians programs. But we're interested in the camera, and this is a master's student who's working in the Arctic, work of a couple master's student here, and building relationships around the cameras, and not pointing cameras and saying, you know, tell us something. It's about how do we tell narratives together. That's kind of the work that we're doing. And on the right, there's a bunch of films that we've made with Indigenous communities that are in the Atlas right now. But we had a conversation, and we brought Elder Kershane together, Frank Brown, and many other Indigenous leaders, including Shilawat Kluche, who's on the left, the Inuk climate change advocate who got co-nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And we said, you know, what should this thing look like moving forward? And this leadership group was established, and they said, well, it should reflect our maps, our values, our knowledges. And so we put together a proposal that we've been pushing out now around an Indigenous climate atlas. And on the right, you can see it's around engaging elders and knowledge keepers, you know, collecting and communicating knowledge, strength-based education with youth, getting cameras and tools and mapping skills. Steve DeRoy from Firelight Group is here. Indigenous mapping and how we kind of build these things together to try and build a tool that, again, might be helpful to the Guardians network. And so we've got a kind of initial thought around how this might work and what this might look like, and we're certainly interested in having conversations with all of you. Canadian Geographic developed the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada, and there's these new map cartographies of Indigenous nations across the country, so we could map climate data by Indigenous cartographies, and there's a lot of opportunity here. And this is just a mock-up of what it could look like moving forward with Indigenous names, Indigenous places at the forefront in the way that this could work. And so I just wanted to offer that. Frank suggested it might be helpful. And to kind of pivot to Frank here, you know, Frank, as a canoe people, as people of the coast, what are your kind of final thoughts to this audience around climate change and where we need to be going?
So, you know, we always have to go back to who we are as Indigenous place-based people. You know, during the International Year for Biodiversity, I was an advisor to Biodiversity BC. And I was sitting in a room full of about 50 scientists, and I basically said, in all due respect, you know, we don't have a word for biodiversity. And what you're talking about doesn't reflect our Indigenous worldview. And I proposed this idea of coastal First Nations fundamental truth regarding biodiversity stewardship and sustainability. And so it was a question. I said, do we have core values or fundamental truths? And of course, I went to our knowledge keepers, a knowledge keeper from Haida, and Namgis, and Heiltsuk, and they were all women. And because I want to say this, and I think it's so important, you know, during the dark time, during the periods of colonization, it was our women that were the ones that kept this close to their hearts, the teachings. They didn't let these colonizing forces that were being projected onto us through public policy and legislation, banning the potlatch and things like that to turn out our fire. It was those women were the true warriors of our society and taught their children, and even if they had to do it in hiding, it's a powerful story. And so I went to women, to the knowledge keepers, and I said, are there core values or fundamental truths? And they said, well, of course, silly. And then over many cups of tea, we talked about this, and I'm going to give a shout out to my wife, Kathy. Kath, can you stand and be recognized, please? She was amazing. She is amazing. So we worked with these women, and I want to share this story about one woman in particular to contextualize this. Gloria Webster Cranmer, who just recently won that, I don't know what they call it now, is it the National Aboriginal Achievement Award? That's what it's called last time. Something else now, Indigenous Inspire. Anyway, she just recently won an award in the Order of Canada, and it was Gloria's father who was put in jail for potlatching. And it's a powerful story, and it was Gloria who came up with this title. I said, you know, Gloria, well, I said to all of them, I'm in this room with scientists, and they have this, it's an adversarial process because it's peer review, and it's almost combative because you're trying to prove and disprove each other's theory on whatever the topic happens to be. And I said, how do I handle that in this room? And she said, you know, we just have to stay the course to stay alive. We didn't create this mess, but we're having to live with it. And so we came up with this idea of core values, respect, amongst one of them, knowledge transfer, adapting to change. And I think that, you know, we kind of ran out of time, and of course the Indians never get enough money. You know, there's all kinds of money for these other scientists and government bureaucrats, but I pitched this to my peers on this table, and I said, we should do a paper that reflects the Indigenous worldview. So they kind of humored me a little bit. So we came up with this document. You can Google it. And what we said was, I also asked them, how are we going to validate our truths? They said, we're going to use language, we're going to use Indigenous practices, we're going to use maps to validate our truth, and we're going to use our stories. And so this was only 3 First Nations, but we all know that we all have stories, our own languages and practices, and we know where our territories are. And so this, we always thought, could be a really effective tool to help inform process. I think they refer to it as an Indigenous pedagogy, a framework, a structure, and a process. Our people know there's great wisdom in the collective minds of our people to come up with systems and processes to go forward. And so this is as an example. The fundamental truth 7 you see on the bottom, adapting to change. Over this, so Ian talked about this film took 4 years. Well, in the middle of that 4 years, they found one of our old village sites. Before that, the carbon dating was 10,000 years. And they found in one of our old village sites. And it was so interesting because it was a big thing, one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in the Americas. And our elders said, we knew that. We knew that. And then they made reference to the language and then the name of the, excuse me, this place is where our first ancestors came to when ice covered all of the Americas, and for the first 7,000 years our people were harpooning sea mammals and surviving off of sea mammals, and then according to the excavation, the second 7,000 years were eating fish because they found fish bones. And so I always say we learned a few things in that time. We have always adapted to change, and as Indigenous place-based people, we will continue to adapt to change. I think we're dealing with a really, really critical issue about the values. I think that's at the heart of this whole issue around sustainability. And we have been a witness to it in our respective territories. If it's just about money, you know, like even forestry as an example is managed according to the stumpage revenue into the treasury. And what we're saying is we have to stop that. At one time they thought the fish was going to go on forever, the timber was going to go on forever, the energy projects. No, it's finite, it's limited. And we have to manage it in a more sustainable way. And we, as the Indigenous place-based people, have our finger on the pulse of what's happening in our respective territories. And it's up to these other governments to create space. It's up to the environmental community to create space and resource us to do the thinking, to do the work, so we could help inform this strategy around how we move forward in a more sustainable way.
Right on. So on the slide, we've got pictures of David, and his family, his daughter, in Haida territory here in some of the images. And David, to close, I'm just curious if you can reflect on the important teachings you received from Indigenous communities and how that knowledge has informed your work and your understanding of the world.
Well, I don't have time to go into all of that. That's a long story. But I do always acknowledge that everything I know and talk about in terms of environmentalism, I've learned from Indigenous people. Starting in Haida Gwaii, but extending across Canada, I'm still on the learning. Dave Crochane is one of my teachers, and I'm getting bits and pieces. But I wanted to say we are at a critical moment that the Ipcc paper really galvanized a lot of thought. I find the film very moving because Terry T.G. and Frank and others say this is not an Indigenous issue. We're all in this together, and it's absolutely true. This is about all of us and finding a more sustainable way. In the 1980s, the United Nations set up a commission under Gro Harlem Brundtland to look at the environmental situation around the world. She was the president or prime minister of Norway. And in 1987, the report was released called Our Common Future, and it coined the term sustainable development in that study. And one of the really striking parts is it said that the great irony of our time is that the only group around the world with any track record of living sustainably with their surroundings were the Indigenous people. And that was a call, really, a shout out that we had something to gain. I just spoke yesterday in Winnipeg at the Aboriginal Chamber of Commerce, and I said, Chambers of Commerce have been fighting me, and I've been fighting them for years. If you're just an Aboriginal tie-in to the paradigm, that the Chamber of Commerce runs on, then I'm not really interested in that. You bring something with a radically different way of looking at the world, and whatever the Chamber of Commerce does, you, to the Aboriginal Chamber of Commerce, have an opportunity to really impose or at least provide a different perspective within which we do our work. I think there's an enormous opportunity now. The original colonizers came here in order with what I call a resourcist attitude. They came here for opportunity, as did my grandparents when they came from Japan. They were poor. They heard there was opportunity here. They didn't care about Indigenous people or flora and fauna. They just wanted the opportunity. And it's a failure. It's been a failure because we're undermining our children's future. And the Indigenous people, the ironic thing is the colonizers tried to get rid of Indigenous culture, language, all of that, because it was an impediment to another way of seeing the world. So now environmentalists are coming and looking to Indigenous people to provide us a context within which we do things. And so the leadership there is very important. This is what makes this such an exciting program. But in order to be fully active and provide the leadership, I believe that Indigenous people and communities have to be strong to do that. Otherwise, you get thrown a few crumbs off the table and suddenly, you know, we jump at that as an opportunity. So one of the remarkable changes in the last 10 years that I see is, I gave a talk in Cape Breton a few months ago, and I was shocked because the people getting up at the meeting, the first thing they did was acknowledge Mi'kmaq territory there. You know, in Cape Breton, I didn't even know there were Mi'kmaq still there. But all across Canada now, whether you're in Quebec or northern Ontario, across the prairies, people acknowledge this is Indigenous territory. But there's a real conundrum here. If this is Indigenous territory, why the hell is it that Indigenous people are the poorest, most vulnerable in our society? So one thing I really think we have to start doing is we got to pay rent. All of Canada is made possible because the transactions, whatever goes on, is on your land. So at least you ought to be developing rent. And I suggested this to both Carolyn Bennett and Jane Philpott. They never answered me, but you know, people ask me, well, what's a reasonable rent? I think 50 cents of every dollar would be a good place, but of course, people just write me off as a loony. You know, well, what about a quarter, a dime? How about 1 cent, a penny of every financial transaction across Canada go to the Indigenous people of the place where that transaction took place? 50? Okay, well, if you want to aim at that. But I think that we should be saying the people who lived here and sustained this area at least ought to get some rent for what we're doing. And then, you know, in order for Indigenous culture to flourish, the land, the place where you live is really important, and for the culture to bloom. And so we have a lot of land, provincial and federal, that is called Crown land. Doesn't make sense to me. That's not Crown land. That's Indigenous land, so give it back. Give it back. And then, of course, we need to have the eyes and ears to steward that land, and that's where the Guardians come in. And I think I'm delighted that the Rangers came here from Australia. It's been a very successful program. But that's what we desperately need the leadership of the Indigenous community, because the dominant society, the paradigm, is a failure. We're destroying a future for our children.
Wow, thank you, David Suzuki. And on that note, I think Frank and Dave Kershane maybe want to take the stage and kind of make some remarks in response to David here. So thanks everybody for watching the film. Yeah, really appreciate your time.
Just so everybody knows, this was brought forward to the joint working group and the ILI to have David be adopted as a honorary guardian. So that's what we're doing here right now. David has We know that David has been a guardian. This happened last night with Buffy. We know Buffy has been a guardian. It's in their hearts and their minds, and have been a tremendous ally. On the coast, we know that adoption is a big thing. We also know, I know, that David has been adopted into the Namgis, the Haida, a prominent family from my community. And so this has been recognized, his contribution and his kindred spirit to us as First Peoples of this land. And this is a way of publicly holding David up and recognizing him for this work that he has done as a strong, strong ally. For those of you that don't know, for the coastal First Nations, it was David and his organization that brought our leadership together. And our organization initially was called the Turning Points Initiative, which morphed into the Coastal First Nations Great Bear Initiative. And that came out of David's support initially. And we will never forget that. And we will always hold you up as a tremendous ally, even though sometimes, David, we've had disagreements. However, that's the way it is with families. And I really appreciated the prayers of our spiritual leader. We could have disagreements. When we got strong minds and strong personalities, that we all have the same idea in mind, but it requires a political discipline, personal discipline, sacrifice for the highest good on all of our part, and that's a part of the task before us. Now I'd like to hand it over to Dave Kershane to do the closing comments. Wallace Gaasika, and thank you very much, David.
Thank you. Being fully aware of our chair here, I'm going to have to keep it really short. You know, when the film was being presented and Dave made his comments and Frank, you know, history always has a tendency to repeat itself. You know, we've heard, I'm sure, the story of Noah's Ark. Well, now we have another ark, and it's called Indigenous Ark, that's going to bring all the people into that ark. You know, and we're going to lead the movement, you know, back with the help of people like David here, who is really, truly, you know, Indigenous, you know, because he speaks from his heart and he speaks from his spirit. And he is an individual, you know, that has spoke on behalf of our people when we couldn't speak. You know, he was out there with that courage, you know, to say, you know, Indigenous people have something. Indigenous people must be allowed to participate in creating the vision that we all need, you know, to create a sustainable world and a more peaceful world. So it gives me great pleasure, David, you know, to be a part of this honoring of you this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. It was such an honor to see David be adopted. I also have gifts for the people that were on that panel. Ginger will kindly turn the gifts over, thanking you for joining us and sharing that wonderful film that was really quite touching and moving. I see that I'm getting a reputation here for... But it's not a bad thing, right? I'm just keeping you on time. And I would like to note that Frank Brown left 5 minutes on the table. How awesome is that? So you get to go to break early, and you'll be back in 15 minutes. So like 10:25-ish. Thank you.